today's show, we have Ariana Brown, who will be speaking about their artwork. So let's begin. Please tell the audience who may not be familiar with, you and your artwork, a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So I'm Ariana. I'm a spoken word poet, performer. I'm also a workshop facilitator. So what that means is I'm really comfortable, the most comfortable on stage performing my poems. So I would generally prefer that people see me perform my poems as opposed to read my poems in a book, because I feel like there's a different kind of energy and spirit that I'm able to bring to the work when it's embodied in performance.
Great. So talk to us about your poetry and the performance work that you do. For those who may not be familiar, what are some of the themes that you cover, the kinds of issues that you speak about?
Well, I'm generally interested in healing, period. And so for me, I think a lot about Audre Lorde's quote, "The personal is political." And I think I really came to writing in the beginning because I wanted to understand myself better. I wasn't necessarily thinking about an audience or who it was going to reach when I began writing. It was always about trying to figure out experiences that I had had with oppression, with anti-Blackness, within Mexican-American communities, figuring out where I fit in all of that. And as I've grown, I've been performing poetry for 7 years now. And so I've been writing about those feelings of exclusion and loneliness that I think happen often when you exist at multiple intersecting identities. And now I'm interested in incorporating research and what I know more about Afro-diasporic communities in a global context into my work to give context to my own personal experiences. If I can tie it to other things outside of my experience, then it kind of helps me understand why people respond to me the way that they do, and how I can use that information as a way of resisting the conditions I've been given. And performance gives me, the opportunity to do that in a really lively way. I get to connect with people. I get to see it on their faces. I get to talk to them after the shows. And that's been, I think, the most empowering thing for me as an artist.
And so you mentioned anti-Blackness in Mexican-American communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that dynamic and just in particular with your experience?
Mm-hmm.
For those who may not know, right? Because
Sure.
why would that be an issue?
Sure. So I am biracial. My dad was a Black American man descended from slaves in Texas, Georgia, and Alabama. And my mom she's a brown mestiza Mexican American. I grew up on the south side of San Antonio, Texas, which is predominantly Mexican immigrant. And my father passed away a year before I was born, a couple months before I was born. And so I was the only Black person in my house, in my family. My mom's side of the family lives in San Antonio, and also in my neighborhood, in my school. So a lot of the first people I met in life had never seen a Black person before. And the way that they thought about Black people was in very racist terms, And I was always made to feel like a spectacle. People were always asking me questions and wanting to touch me and my hair, speaking about me in Spanish as if I wasn't in the room. And because I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, I was made to feel excluded from the community that I actually do belong to, And for a long time, I felt like I couldn't blame them, because if they had never seen a Black person, well, of course, then I would be confusing to them. But that made me feel very isolated from a very young age, sort of walking through the world feeling like I was this alien and I didn't have any reflections of myself and my immediate surroundings. And so now, right, like in undergrad, I studied African diaspora studies and Mexican American studies, and I learned that there is a significant Black population in Mexico. So there really is no reason why Mexicans and Mexican Americans should be responding to me, in these ways, with exclusion. And so learning that really helped contextualize like my existence, to really prove that I'm not actually alone, and that that my loneliness and my exclusion is not necessary. It's not a thing that has to exist. And so with my work now, I'm really interested in not only like proving the existence of Black Mexicans, but demanding more from Mexican American communities, to say, there's no reason why I should have to, go to Afro-Latino specific spaces in order to feel at home if Mexican Americans are my community, then they should treat me like community members.
Mm. And I think that that experience speaks to a historical legacy of colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
both in Mexico and the U.S., and in
Yeah.
terms of how anti-blackness and also anti-indigeneity, the ways in which,
Mm-hmm.
in this colonial context, historically and in contemporarily,
Yeah.
these are the things that people really are uncomfortable with or are not even very educated about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's some strategic ways in which blackness gets erased
Yeah.
in Mexico. And then it's a different history here in the U.S., but I think that that's why there's so much work that needs to be done in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways your poetry kind of helps fill in a lot of those gaps that exist culturally, socially, historically,
Mm-hmm.
and then contemporarily, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about when you started to get connected to poetry, or poetry as a way in which, as you mentioned, could be a form of healing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah. So I've been writing for as long as I can remember, but in middle school, I became very interested in sort of doing independent research on Black history, right? That was when we finally got a computer in our house. And so, the internet was this huge resource that I could use because there weren't people in my family that could teach me about Black history, They didn't have those answers. And so I went to the internet, and I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching Malcolm X speeches and James Baldwin speeches. And I was really amazed at, especially with Malcolm X, because he, like me, was someone who came from a poor family, who didn't have access to a lot of resources, and his teachers didn't think that he was going to succeed in life, and they told him that, And it kind of amazed me that someone like Malcolm X, who sort of came from nothing, who had all the odds, all the odds were stacked against him, could get up in front of a group of people and using only language, move, inspire, empower, change, He has this particular speech called "Who Taught You to Hate Yourself?" And that was the first moment in which I got to witness a Black person speaking directly to an audience of Black people, asking them to imagine a world in which they are free, demanding that they love themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a message I had got anywhere else in such explicit terms. And I thought, wow, that something like that is possible. But also, if Malcolm can do it, can get up in front of a group of people and sort of change what they believe, and make a different future possible for them, maybe I can do that too. And that's what made me interested in performing, and making the language come alive with an audience like that.
And then how did that inspiration translate to actually performing?
Yeah.
Did it happen in high school? Did it happen in college? Where did that happen, that transition from just being inspired to then actually doing it?
In 8th grade, I had a reading teacher who was very supportive of me writing poems. I would share my poems with her, and she would write on little Post-it notes and give them back to me after class. And she recommended that I be one of the performers for our school's Black History Month showcase. And I got to read an original poem that I wrote on stage in front of the whole school. And I was extremely shy and introverted in middle school, and I had a lot of bullies, and I didn't feel like I belonged at all. But it was a really kind of wild experience for me, being on stage with the microphone and having to watch my whole school be silent and listen to me, right? For as long as I had the stage, I could say whatever I wanted, And I thought, wow, this is real power, right? As a 13-year-old. And what amazed me was that, everyone listened, and when I finished my poem, everybody clapped for me. And just the sound of that, I didn't know if that was necessarily acceptance, but since that wasn't a feeling that I was used to having, it made me feel empowered. And so performing was healing in that way. And as I began to write more, I learned how to be more honest with myself about what I'm writing down. What is the intention of this poem, for me? And then when I'm performing it, how can I perform this in a way that I feel free at the end of it, that I feel good about what I left on the stage, and that I'm responsible with what I'm bringing to an audience.
And, we should at least let the viewers know you're also award-winning many competitions, right? And your poetry's been published in a variety of anthologies and, settings, writing settings. So can you talk more about just that experience of, being in slams or being in competitions or, being selected to, you win, right? So
Sure.
in terms of affirming the power of your voice and your artwork.
Yeah. So I started slamming or performing poems competitively as a teenager. I competed on my first slam team when I was 17. I represented Austin at the National Youth Poetry Slam Brave New Voices, which was in the Bay Area, California, for 2 years. And then from there, I was a coach, a mentor with the collegiate slam at UT Austin. So I've been in the slam scene for a while now. And I really appreciate it because there are set rules for poetry slam. Poems have to be a certain length, you can't use any props. There's all of these like specific rules for the slam format. I think when you're able to set the guidelines for a space, then it makes things possible in a very particular way, because people know what the rules are, so they know how to respond to poems. And that really, I don't know, I feel like I really found my voice in slam. My first mentor in slam, her name is Ebony Stewart, and she's a poet from Central Texas. She's the only 3-time female slam champ of Austin. And she always told us that the points don't matter. And that was the most useful thing I've ever learned from slam, because I think poetry is not like a sport, right? And that, if I make a basket in basketball, that's 2 points. If I make a 3-pointer, that's 3 points. Poetry is subjective, so how can you give a number to that? How can you say that this person's poetry is better than this person's poetry, And so Ebony always told us, as long as you're being present in your poems, as long as you're showing up in the spaces and being responsible for your emotions and not lying to yourself and the audience, as long as you're being present and you're being honest and you feel good about what you left on the stage, and that's all that matters. And I think that makes it easier to say, yes, these awards or these moments in which people recognize me for the work I was doing, that's awesome. But what matters to me the most is that, do I feel good about what I just left on the stage? Do I feel like that was honest? Was I being brave? And those are the moments that make me feel the most accomplished.
Okay, so I think at this point it would be a great transition. I'm now excited to see if you could perform a poem.
Sure.
In the slam tradition or whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to do now is then take a quick little break so that we can transition into Ariana Brown's poem or poetry, whatever it is that you want to do. So we'll be right back.
My friend asks if I know how to cumbia and offers his hand on the dance floor. I'm an introvert, baby caterpillar, little bug who forgets she has a body. Sometimes. I think of my grandmother, who's always trying to get me to dance, always speaking to me in Spanish, hoping I'll understand, who wants me to be as free as I deserve in this lifetime. I think I've been to 3 quinceañeras in my life, 1 Mexican wedding, countless parties at my tia's house, chapel of red cups and swaying blood. My friend asks if I know how to cumbia, and I remember the shuffled feet, sudden turns, bodies dripping slow as smoke onto shoulders, drinking in memories of better days, linked kneecaps holding up what they've got left to give to the music. Or I remember couples who move like warm honey, stilted swagger, fast as an argument, banter pattern, like they're chasing each other toward the last bit of love at the corner of the backyard. My mom taught me to cumbia once, cleared a space big enough for my father's ghost to join us and put Pandora on shuffle. Here goes. At first, she danced alone to show me the steps. Then her hands were invitations, and our knees were locked and safe between each other, and we stumbled and stitched a memory onto the living room carpet. I know she would rather have held my father, but this was a kind of joy too, forged by pressing into the body what words cannot do. And you can't tell me there aren't many ways to be religious, to have found a spirit and woke the limbs for a precious visit. I bore my heels into the floor and danced with my mother, who in another life is dancing with my father. And when she spins me around, she is turning back time to remember the woman she is, the woman she was before. It is those who dance who best keep memory alive. When my friend asked if I knew how to cumbia in the moment, I'd been out of practice. I'd forgotten the lesson a loved one, my mother, the sun, had taught me, and so I danced with him the way wallflowers dance, quiet and timid, my blood only barely flickering, wishing it was flame. Later, another friend sends me an article that says there's a reason cumbia is one of the easiest dances to learn, that though the cumbia is popular everywhere, it originates in Colombia. The first people to do it did so in chains. Enslaved black folk couldn't lift shackled feet, so instead they shuffled and invented the cumbia. And you can't tell me there aren't many ways to survive, to remember the dead, to make a freedom where there isn't one.
So we're back, and that was amazing. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to still continue the interview. I'm really excited to know more about just there's so much to talk about, basically. And one of the things I'm curious about is you mentioned that you studied African American Studies and Mexican American Studies at UT Austin, correct? So how was that experience? Why did you choose to study these fields? And how do you think that they inform the writing that you're doing? Or in other words, maybe an easier way to put it is, why are these fields important?
Yeah.
Why did you decide to choose to study these fields?
Yeah. Well, I came into UT as an English major, and I quickly realized I was going to have to take a lot of classes about dead white people who were racist, you know, in order to get that actual degree. And I just was not interested in doing that at that point in my life. And at this point, really ever. So I talked to my advisor, and she said, well, you've already fulfilled a minor in English, and you've also already fulfilled a minor in African Diaspora Studies with the electives you've been taking, so why don't you just major in African Diaspora Studies? And I said, oh, that sounds amazing, let's do that. And I feel like I really found a home in Black Studies. That was the first time that I had met people who knew so much about Black people, about everything that we had experienced and resisted and been through. And I really felt, anytime I came to those classes, I knew that I was going to feel very emotionally charged in there. And there was never a day when I went to a Black Studies class and I had to ask myself, why is this relevant? Or why is this important? How does this apply to my everyday life? Because I already knew. They didn't even have to tell me why. I could feel it, you know, and I was so engaged in every class discussion because I knew why it was important, you know. And so once I had fulfilled my African Diaspora Studies degree, I think one semester before I was about to graduate, they let me know that my school was offering a study abroad in Mexico City. But I was set to graduate, and I was like, well, I really want to study abroad in Mexico City. They had not had any study abroad programs in Mexico since the narco violence had began. Oh, right. So if I wasn't able to do this, I would never be able to study abroad in Mexico City, in Mexico, period. So I had already fulfilled a minor in Mexican American Studies with my electives again. So I added Mexican American Studies as a double major, and I studied abroad in the FF for 6 weeks. And transitioning to Mexican American Studies was interesting because my foundation was in Black Studies, you know, and when we think about race, whiteness and Blackness exist on a spectrum, right, with whiteness at one end and Blackness at the other end, and everyone else falls somewhere in between. And I've always understood that in order to really effectively organize, you have to have a grounding in what Blackness means and how it operates in the world. And so when I transitioned to Mexican American Studies, all of my professors were non-Black Mexican Americans who didn't necessarily have a real understanding of how Blackness works in the world. They often conflated race and ethnicity, which was frustrating for me because I don't have the luxury to do that because I move in the world as a Black person, right. You know? And so taking up space in those classrooms and asking people to really challenge themselves, you know, to say, this analysis is lazy, it doesn't account for me. And when you don't account for Black people, when you don't account for the most marginalized people of your community, you're not doing effective liberatory work, you know? So you have to account for the most vulnerable person in the room. So try harder, you know? So I feel like those ideas, everything that I learned in ethnic studies informs not only my poems, but just how I show up in the world, period. You know, I think it helps me to always try and be aware of who is the most vulnerable person in the room right now. How can I make sure that my poems don't overlook them when I'm talking about my own experiences?
And I think because, in particular, the the relations of power are so central to the field that these are the kinds of, I mean, they're very appropriate questions and concerns that should be central to the field. I think it's important to also locate the context, because you're speaking about Texas in particular, right? Which has its own particular history. It's a very conservative state politically, and you know, to some degree part of the South even, and also Southwest, and its own entity. So there's so many things going on that it's important to contextualize. But I do think that, I mean, even the name Mexican American Studies versus Chicano Studies already presents a different kind of political impetus there. So I think it's really important to raise these concerns that you're mentioning, and also just how the field moves and changes. I think very, very important things to think about as ethnic studies keeps evolving, because it's far from perfect, for sure. And you know, like recently there's a push more towards intersectionality, for example, or settler colonialism, and I think this is part of how the field evolves. And I just find it interesting that as a writer, English didn't do that for you, and these other fields, you know, however imperfect they were, somehow provided something that the other disciplines weren't providing. So I find that interesting because while teaching ethnic studies, I see a lot of students who sometimes trickle in, maybe as they're about to graduate, and they're like, why didn't I know this before? And I think that just speaks to how institutional racism works within the university sometimes, right? Like, why are we this field that kind of nobody even knows about? So now you're doing an MFA in creative writing? Poetry. So how has that process been like for you? Can you talk more about your experience post-undergrad, now in a graduate studies program?
Sure. Well, the MFA, it feels a lot like I'm getting a degree in English again. So I don't love it for that reason. I feel like where I've learned the most and felt the most spiritually engaged and connected is when I'm performing for my community members, when I'm like con mi gente in San Antonio, you know. And I feel like when I can write poems that, because I feel like the MFA, right, is really geared toward like making sure you can write with them in the way that the academy writes, you know, and appreciates. But those are not poems that my grandmother would want to read. Those are not poems that people in my community who have never gone to college would even care about, you know? And so I'm really interested in writing work that speaks to their experiences, because those are the people that I'm really writing for. They're the people who made me. They're the people who made the conditions for me to exist possible. So I owe them everything, you know? So I'm always trying to write poems that resonate with them, that feel truthful to their experiences. And also hold them accountable, right, for their like moments of anti-Blackness.
So what advice do you have for students, or in particular some young people who may not see themselves as poets, or who may be interested in writing but don't really know how to continue developing this craft? What would you say to them?
I would say trust your instincts. You know, if you feel like writing, if writing makes you feel better, if it makes you feel good, if it makes you feel alive, then trust that. You know, you have those instincts for a reason. And, you know, slam is not for everybody. Performing is not for everybody. Again, if that feels good to you, then go with it. But if all you need from writing is writing something in your notebook and it's out and then you're good, then I think that's perfectly valid. You know, I think we live in a capitalist society that tells us if we're not constantly producing things for a specific purpose that we know the value of, then why bother doing it? And I think that's whack. I think if something makes you feel alive, then you should do it. If you're not hurting anybody, you know, if you're getting some kind of like spiritual release and it feels good and healthy to you, then do it. It's a tool at your disposal.
I think it's important to highlight that sometimes people have an idea of what they consider is a poet, right? And we should just free ourselves from these notions, because as I mentioned to some of my students, you write your name down and you're not a writer. I mean, of course the academy will say no, but if we start to free ourselves from these narratives that we have, then maybe you'll write your name and continue to keep writing, you know, like, so why not? So I think it's important to see that there's a variety of ways in which we can express ourselves. For some, it might be the slam scene, right? But for others, it may not. Does that make it any different? Well, you know, it's just whatever works for you and whatever's comfortable for you, but to not see yourself without that possibility,
right?
You know, because there's so many ways in which we can express ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Any other last minute thoughts or?
Well, actually, you were saying that. I was thinking a really good friend of mine who was on it, we've been on many slam teams together, and she's a dear friend of mine. Her name is Lois. She actually never writes down her poems. Lois, I'm not sure what tradition she's trained in or if this is just how she shows up in the world. But Lois writes her poems in her head, you know, and for her it never involved the physical act of writing, you know, and every time you saw Lois do a poem, there would be something about it slightly different, you know, because she never memorized it exactly the same. But that's what felt good to her. That was how her spirit moved her, you know, and she still came alive on the stage and was honest and brave every time I saw her. So again, I feel like, you know, everyone has their own unique ways of showing up to their creative calling, you know, and if you can figure out what that is for yourself, then more power to you.
Great. Well, thank you again for being here. On that note, that's it for today's episode in Woke in the CV. Please check out other upcoming shows.